Hello everyone, welcome back to another one of our summaries and going through the Bible. I want to do this with you book by book to give you a general overview of the events that are in Scripture so that as we are going through these things in our topical and thematic Bible studies in this ministry to reach the gospel to those who otherwise wouldn't have an access or association with it, I'd like to give you guys just as much of an overview and as much information about God's Word as possible. And so I want to do one study, one book, and that'll be the same for the Psalms and all 150 chapters therein, as well as the book of Jude, which would be remarkably shorter than 150 chapters. And as we're going through this, I hope not only to inform you, but to give you a background so that you understand the Bible in its historical context, because just like Scripture, there is a standard that we would hold anything in literature to, and that is that if it makes sense literally, it's meant to be taken literally. But if there is some symbols to be taken, you want to take it in light of the whole message. You want to see, has this been referenced elsewhere? And hopefully with this familiarity in the Bible as a whole, this will equip you to not only know what events to look for, what topics you'd be most interested to look more into in your own personal study of God's Word, but also to be able to understand these things in a 40,000 feet view, so to speak. So if you'd like to join me in that, we'll be in the second book of the Bible, which is also the second book of the Torah, the Pentateuch. It's what's called the books of Moses, known as Exodus. Following up from where we left off in Genesis, 400 years of history has passed from chapter 50 of Genesis to chapter 1 of Exodus. And these events are summarized for us in the first chapter. That as Israel has made its residency in Egypt, because of Joseph, they have been basically a living fulfillment that God made to Abraham, and the promises thereof of him being a father of many nations. Israel has grown, and grown by a lot. And as well, just like is the case for any time in history, there comes a time when leaders are rising up that don't necessarily take history, their history in particular, as seriously as they should. And Egypt was no exception. So to give you guys an understanding of this book historically, this is where we begin. Now, also, I think what's worth noting before we start getting into the 7 main events that I've chosen, and note there were others, but the summaries of this book just as an overview, the Cliff Notes version of Exodus. It's also important to ask in any book the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and the how. What was the purpose of this whole book? Well, the who was Moses. Moses was the one who physically penned the book of Exodus. He is the author, as he witnessed this history firsthand. Now, the Bible is inspired by God, but he used men to record these specific events in history to show how he was interacting with us, and specifically for the focus of our redemption. We started in Genesis of how he made everything right and continued into what went wrong, where we are today. Well, Exodus continues that journey, specifically speaking to the people of Israel historically. So, with that in mind, then, we have to ask when this was written in history. Well, the dating of the book of Exodus goes back to 1450 BC. So that would be 3,467 years from the time of this recording. And that is a remarkable amount of history. So noting that it is not only a BC book, but a remarkably ancient BC book, we should be taking it in the light of the way that books would be written back then. We like to summarize things event by event by event, and Exodus does that in a way as well, but it also has a certain format that you need to understand was utilized in this time period. So that's important to understand as well. What kind of book is this intended to be written as? Remember, we cited that there were 3 different books in the Bible as far as how they're categorized. It starts with history, moves on to poetry, and then concludes with prophecy. This is the same for the New Testament as well as the Old. The Old Testament, of course, would note this in the section that is eyewitness history, as it was physically penned by Moses and the others who were witnessing these events happen firsthand. Where was this book written? Mount Sinai. This was a region in the Arabian Peninsula where Israel had settled after departing from Egypt and settling in the area that they would ultimately be receiving the law. This was one of the 3 books that Moses brought down that ultimately would govern Israel in understanding not only their conduct today, but their history and what had led them up to this point. And that was the purpose as to why this book was given. It was to ultimately to know what God had done for them in their past, and based on that information, know that he was worth trusting in the future. And that's how this was ultimately given. God and Moses both bore direct eyewitness to this history and verified it with people, places, events, and other things that we could look and dig up and confirm that would only affirm the Bible is as true as it would claim itself to be. So that's where I'd like to start. Moses' birth. 400 years after Joseph's death, at the end of Genesis, Israel has grown as a people in Egypt, and so much so to the point that the Israelites actually outnumbered the Egyptians. Now, why didn't the Israelites then just uprise over the Egyptians and take over and just rename Egypt Israel? Well, because they understood why they were there. They had a promise to their ancestors that they would be living in Canaan, but not after 400 years had passed. You could read more of this in the book of Genesis. But as this was spoken to their forefathers, Joseph was ultimately the one who established their presence in the region of Egypt known as Goshen. That's where they would be taking care of the Egyptians' flocks and herds. A shepherd's job was the dirtiest, most filthy, unclean thing that the Egyptians would ever not even imagine involving themselves in. That's why they had the Israelites do it. They appreciated not having to get their hands dirty, because you would understand if you are walking where only sheep have walked before, there's going to be some collateral damage, so to speak, especially on your shoes. But the point being made in all of this is basically Egyptian and Israelite culture is set at a crux from the beginning. The Egyptians, they plucked their eyebrows, shaved their head, they wore the mascara, they made sure that no hair was on their bodies because they were deathly afraid of lice. They even made a god of lice to make sure that it wouldn't have anything to do with them. So that was the culture, and you could tell the Israelites, as a contrast, were more just give me the tool, I'll do the job for you if you won't. So that's where we're starting in all of this. But just like the Egyptians were, for all intents and purposes, pretty prissy in the ancient days, they were also pretty slow on the upkeep concerning where their history actually came from. We don't know anything of what that's like today. There arose a Pharaoh in Egypt, Exodus says, that did not know Joseph. Therefore, he looked at the Israelites not as an asset, not as a blessing, and obviously not as a source of God's presence in their lives, and ultimately what had prospered their nation up until this point, and had made them the superpower that they were because of Joseph's preparations in the 7 years of famine that would follow the 7 years of plenty. Once again, more on this in Genesis. Imagine that, a whole book making references constantly to events that were just talked about. But follow along with me here. Pharaoh looked at the Israelites and didn't understand that they were no threat to him, didn't have reason to think they wouldn't be a threat to him, and obviously only saw they outnumbered him. And in those days, if you had a people group that weren't from your people in your nation and you were under military attack, if you didn't have them all under your thumb, then they would just uprise against you and help them take over. They'd pass on one king to another. It would be a liability rather than an asset. And so, as what later passages would affirm as an idea inspired by Satan and definitely modeled after his heart, Pharaoh decided that the best way to make sure the Israelites wouldn't rise up against them wasn't to check their history, but to make their lives defined by slavery, to make their lives so miserable that they just wouldn't want to have children and bring them into this nightmare that the Egyptians would make of their lives. And so that ultimately became the status quo for Egypt over these centuries, or rather for the Israelites, and God still blessed them. They still grew as a nation, and in fact, they grew more in spite of their circumstances, because that's always how God works. Pharaoh was not ecstatic about these turn of events, about the God of the Israelites blessing them in spite of his efforts to limit that. So he decides to introduce a government-enforced Planned Parenthood operation where any male child that would be born in Israel or to an Israelite would be thrown into the Nile River. He commanded the midwives, the people who would help the Israelite women give birth, that if it was a boy, if there was a stem on the apple, then they'd dispose of it. And if there wasn't, then this girl would eventually grow up to marry a nice Egyptian boy, or not so nice given the cultural stereotypes that are being defined for us here in history. And essentially Israel would just disappear. They would be assimilated into Egyptian culture, and all of their babies would be Egyptians, and that would just be the way that it went. But the problem was that the midwives feared God more than they feared Pharaoh and weren't willing to slaughter hundreds of millions of innocent babies. And so Pharaoh had to resort to drastic measures. If the midwives wouldn't do it, he's like, why didn't you do your job? And they said, sorry, they were already born when we got there. I mean, these Hebrew women, they're pretty lively. Whatever that would mean in regards to childbirth. But nonetheless, the Pharaoh got pretty desperate, and so he said, fine, I'm going to enforce this myself. I'm going to send my soldiers in to make sure that these babies are disposed of. And that's where Moses' parents came in. They had a baby boy. Jochebed and Amram were their names, as further affirmed in Hebrews chapter 11. And they saw that this baby was something special, that this baby had a calling by God. And so she, like any mother would, went out of her way to save her child's life. So by obeying the government's orders, she put her son into the Nile River. But she didn't also include the detail that she could make him a boat. It was this little ark made of pitch and wood and all these other leaves and such, and she just let this basket essentially flow down the river, and Miriam, who was already had been born, which was Moses' older sister, and he wasn't named Moses yet, but follow along with me here. This baby, who's yet unnamed, would be put down the Nile River, and Miriam would make sure that nothing bad happened to him. And then if, it just essentially reached the end of the creek and nothing had happened, then Miriam would bring it back, and the soldiers would have been none the wiser. They'd say, where's your son? I heard you had a baby recently. And she's like, oh, I put him in the Nile River like you told me to, which was true, but not the way that Pharaoh intended it. Anyway, if this couldn't get more ironic, God has a sense of humor in how he lets these events turn out, because as Miriam is watching Moses in his little ark just going down the river, she comes to the place where Pharaoh's daughter is bathing. And, of course, she's got her assistants, all the guards and stuff. Obviously, they were probably girls, too. Making sure that none of the boys were peeping on her and stuff. And that's when they see this basket, and Pharaoh's daughter's like, hey, bring that here. And she opens it up, and she sees this beautiful little baby, and she just wants it. She wants to take it home with her. I mean, Daddy gets me anything. I now have a baby. This is mine. And that's when Miriam comes out of the brush and basically says, hey, I noticed that you just found that baby. There's a woman here, an Israelite woman, who'd be willing to nurse the baby for you. She had a baby recently. She's producing milk. Would you like to pay for her services? And she's like, oh, that'd be great. And so, catch the irony of all this. Pharaoh, who was inspired by Satan to prevent this specific child from being born, God's plan for Israel's salvation and by extension all of mankind, now is paying to raise the son that Satan inspired him to kill on his own dime. So God's very funny. So this is what's happening. This is how Moses was named as such. Moses' name meant one drawn out of the water. And so that essentially became the definition of his life, the gift from the God. So this is a wonderful thing for our nation and for our family. And according to historians, Jewish historians like Flavius Josephus, we have records of Moses not only leading military campaigns in Egypt and being a well-spoken orator, which was very prized in that ancient day, but even more significantly than that, The definition of Moses' life was he walked like an Egyptian, he talked like an Egyptian, and many believe that he was being groomed for the Egyptian crown. Now, I know that you've seen movies like Prince of Egypt, and you've seen all these other renditions like the colossal failure that is known as the Bible TV series, but ultimately we need to stick to the text, and that's what I'm attempting to do here today. Moses was on Easy Street his entire life, and for 40 years, the definition of his life had been as an Egyptian. But here's the problem. Moses knew that he was a Hebrew, because for some reason, for the first few years of his life, he wasn't being raised in Pharaoh's house, but rather in this Egyptian nanny's house, which actually was his biological mother. And you could imagine that Jochebed and Amram, Moses' parents, had taken every single second that they could to pour into their child's life who he was, what his calling was, who his God was. And after being exposed to everything that the Egyptian culture had to offer, Hebrews 11 tells us that Moses ultimately concluded that he would rather face the worst day he had with his family's God than the best possible day with the gods of Egypt, that the fleeting pleasures of this life never ultimately amounted to what they promised. And so Moses had this desire to want to liberate the people of Israel from their abuse and from their slavery and from everything that the Egyptians were subjecting them to. And understand, Pharaoh's entire genocidal campaign, infanticidal basically, campaign against the people of Israel was based on the idea. His entire paranoia was centered on this one idea: they might rise up against me. They might become a contingency rather than an asset. These people are a threat to me, even though they haven't demonstrated anything yet. I have to stop it before it starts. And so, Moses decides to be that leader. But according to his plan, he decides, in order to announce himself as Israel's liberator, to be the one to rise up against the Egyptians, he sees an Egyptian taskmaster abusing a fellow Israelite, and he decides to murder him. Now, this wouldn't have been hard for Moses. He had led several battles up until this point, if the historical records are reliable, and was more than likely trained in hand-to-hand, Krav Maga and all this kind of stuff. Everything that Moses had going for him at his full capability easily was able to take care of one Egyptian. But guess what was the result? Not only did the people of Israel want nothing to do with them, they had gotten used to this life at this point. But even worse, now Pharaoh's looking at Moses and saying, that which I greatly feared is now coming to pass. You are the focus of everything that I've been willing to sacrifice millions of lives in order to accomplish. Moses ran for his life, and rightly so. So by failing to basically fulfill God's calling for his life, and that was to liberate the people of Israel from their slavery and lead them back to the promises that God had made to their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses had failed, and now was going to spend the next 40 years of his life in the region of Midian. Now, Midian, for those of you who don't know, Egypt is at the top northeastern hemisphere of Africa, the very top right corner. And likewise, the Middle East is the borders of Saudi Arabia, and then you have Israel and Jordan and Iran over here, and basically just the Fertile Crescent as a whole. Midian is that little triangle between Africa and the Middle East. And for those of you who've seen pictures, not exactly a tourist destination unless you're associating it with the figures that have walked through it historically. So this essentially became his life. He went from hero to zero. He went from somebody to a nobody and spent the next 40 years working as, take a guess, growing up as an Egyptian. Do you think that he was wearing the mascara, shaving his head, making sure he has no contact with the dirty sheeps? Guess what he's doing now? He's a shepherd, and he's working for a man whose name, accounts also know him as Jethro, or I have it written down here, Ruel was his name as well. And essentially this would be how he'd associate himself to his people in Midian and how he was known to the people of Israel, because imagine that, two different languages, two different words. But Ruel essentially allowed Moses to marry one of his daughters, whose name was Zipporah, and there he had two sons, Gershom and Eleazar. And it was during these 40 years that essentially he was gaining, well, what was the first 40 years of his life being spent doing? It was thinking that he can do anything. And now he's spending the next 40 years of his life from 41 to 80 going, I'm not capable of anything. I'm doing that which I hate do. I was raised hating to want anything to do with. And after these 40 years, essentially, that was the definition of his life. He had ultimately been brought down to the most humble state any other human being could be. And by the way, Moses wrote those words. So, let's take the point. He definitely was humbled. But that's where ultimately God was able to use him. And so he had his encounter with the burning bush. And this bush was described not as just this entity or hallucination. I'm sure you remember the Jim Gaffigan comedy routine where Moses, comes out and announces, hey, God just spoke to me as a burning bush. And the response would be, sure he did. Moses, maybe I think you've been burning some bush. Well, there's a reason why I don't think that is a sound conclusion to make historically. Based on the information that we have, understand that the burning bush wasn't burning in the normal sense. It was on fire, granted, but it wasn't burning up. Well, maybe it was a drug-induced hallucination. How do we know that this basically effigy that Moses experienced was not anything more than just maybe a hookah or a marijuana plant, a hallucinogen that caused him to think that he was being called to let the people of Israel go? Well, some problems with that conclusion, because first off, not only does the bush speak to him, not normal, sometimes a result of drug-induced hallucinations, but on top of that, Aaron also had a conversation, that's Moses' older brother, who had a same conversation with God on this matter, ultimately calling him to the same duty. Now, I don't know much about hallucinations, but I do know that they occur in one's mind, and no two people are going to have the exact same dream. Unless it wasn't in fact a dream. It was a communication from the same source. And likewise, the things that Moses was told to do in order to get Pharaoh to be convinced was to perform miraculous signs and wonders that naturally would catch the attention of Egyptians that usually associate gods with, well, show me a trick, show me your God's power in order to convince me to do something. And God indeed met the Egyptians where they were at. But what was interesting about this was, did Moses collect the bush and burn it in front of Pharaoh and said, look what my God can do, while he was tripping out on acid? No. That's not what happened. And likewise, all of Egypt saw those miraculous signs. So was this bush just basically an access to more hallucinogenics than we have available on the planet, causing an entire country to trip out for a period of several months, mind you, in these miraculous ways? Once again, that's not plausible given the information that we have. So this interaction is taken at face value, because based on the historical results of the interaction, we can't conclude that it was a hallucination because multiple people had the same encounter. We can't conclude that this was an individual hallucination that just circumstantially lined up with Aaron's ascent to power, because Pharaoh and all of Egypt also fell for the miraculous signs demonstrated by this angel. And lastly, this angel that appeared to him in the bush wasn't just an angel. It wasn't some spiritual entity that was just trying to play a joke on him. The angel that is being spoken of here, that spoke to Moses through the bush, introduces itself as God. And this is what we would know as the angel of the Lord, Jesus Christ himself appearing pre-incarnate before he entered this earth physically through the womb of Mary. So follow along with me here. The angel of the Lord appears to Moses in a bush that was burning but not being burned up. Interesting, a self-sustaining resource. And he told Moses that he was God. He was God. Not that he represented God. He was God. And to tell Pharaoh to let his people go. And understand that at first, this was just going to be for a weekend. The first and opening offer towards Pharaoh was just give them a day off so that they can worship God in the wilderness. And it was only after Pharaoh had basically denied every single possible chance that God could have given him to recognize his authority that he said, you've lost the right to have anything to do with my people anymore. And God knew this would be the end result from the beginning. But he told Moses to go. Tell my people that you are going to lead them to the promised land. Well, Moses said, I don't want to go. Well, God said, tell you what, I'll give you signs that will prove to Pharaoh who I am. And there were 3 signs. You're probably familiar with one of them, but I'll start with the 2 that you're probably not. First, Moses was told to put his hand inside of his tunic and then pull it out, and it would be pure white and leprous, literally rotted and ready to die. Then he would put it back in his coat, pull it out, and it would be made whole again. Interesting. I don't think they would have a lot of makeup that would cause muscles to temporarily atrophy, and that would definitely require, based on my magician friends, a lot of angle work in order to make sure that that would be how this would work exactly the way that the angel spoke. I would take it as a miracle. If you don't want to, maybe the second 2 will. The second sign that God told Moses to show to Pharaoh, getting our names right here. That's why I have to go off my notes, because this just comes out funny. My much learning has made me mad. I need this structure. Forgive me. When Moses was told also to show to Pharaoh, he told him to get some water and then make sure that it's water. Can you taste it? Can you see it? Okay. Pour it out, and it would become rotted and stinking blood. Just chalky and cakey corpse blood. Not red tide, mind you. No, this was drinking water from a stream. Well, that would be impressive. And then finally, he was told to take his stick, have it hit the ground, and it would turn into a snake. And then Moses was told, pick it up by the tail. By the way, for those of you who don't have a lot of familiarity interacting with snakes, you don't do that. Because if you grab the end of the tail, the business end's going to come around and bite you. But God said, let me worry about that. Grab the tail. So he grabbed it, and it turned back into a stick. Very interesting affirmations. But Moses, seeing this firsthand, still said, I don't want to go. Well, God told him in advance how this would all work out, so he wouldn't be surprised. He said Pharaoh wouldn't listen, that I would show my wonders in all of Egypt, and that you would ultimately come back to this very same spot where I will give you my law, and lead you personally into the promised land as far as everything would go in their history, as according to how he promised to their ancestors, that he knew well. Moses still don't want to go. Well, now God started to get annoyed. And I imagine the case. So God said, fine, I'll speak to your older brother Aaron and have him go with you. He can speak for you. But I am calling you to do this, and you're going to do this. So Moses went, okay, I'm sorry. Moses went, and then he met Aaron, who had the same interaction and encounter, and was fully aware of what God was calling him to do. And so they went together and started to go to the land of Egypt, where, Aaron went out to Midian to meet his brother. Imagine, someone probably told him to do that. And they started to go to the promised land, and Zipporah and Gershom and Eleazar were also going with him. But there was a problem. What was God calling Moses to tell the Pharaoh? Let my people go. What was he calling the nation of Israel to do? To follow God without compromise. They had been born and raised. 400 years had passed, so you'd imagine these generations had basically had any sort of relationship with the true and living God. As far as actively and personally, they've fallen into distant memory. They knew their nation's history, but this is where they were living now. And being raised in this pagan culture, God was calling them back to a relationship with Him. And this would require not only the sign of their covenant, what would set them apart from the other nations, specifically that of circumcision, the physical cutting off of the foreskin of the male's genitals. And as a model, for those of you who don't know, circumcision is cutting off the outer skin of a man's private parts. And this was for the reason and based on the example of what Abraham chose to do. God didn't command, Abraham chose, and God honored that sign. Why? Because Abraham, in making this gesture to God, was saying this: you've promised to give me more kids than I could ever imagine, and I don't have one kid on my own. Therefore, this tool that is used to make children is no longer for my pleasure, but for your purposes. I dedicate it to you by cutting off a section of what gives me pleasure in it. That's where the circumcision ritual came from. That's what its purpose and intention was meant to communicate. It would set Israel apart from all the other nations. So, while this was going on, understand that Zipporah was not an Israelite. She was a daughter of a Midianite by the name of Jethro, or Ruel. And Zipporah, you could imagine, was okay with Moses, maybe circumcising the firstborn baby, but you aren't touching my little Gershie. You're not, leave him alone. I'll think about it when he's 13. The Ishmaelites kind of do that, but no, you aren't touching my baby. Well, this would be a note of compromise on Moses' part, wouldn't it? And so when Moses would be called by God to be the leader of the nation of Israel, what do you think the Israelites would do if they're just looking at your son and saying, well, why should we take God seriously? You don't. And this is something that God holds very, very close to the chest. If someone's going to speak his word, they had better be practicing it themselves. There's a common saying, if it doesn't work at home, then don't export it. Well, Moses essentially was given the opportunity to represent God to the nation of Israel, and yet there was an area of compromise here. So when he got to the border of the land of Egypt and being able to communicate this, God was about to kill him. And Zipporah knew exactly why. And I'm not kidding, this is what happened. Zipporah literally took a sharp rock as Moses was being, I don't know what was going on, but she could tell that God was doing this and exactly why God was doing this. She took a sharp rock, dropped Gershom's drawers, and circumcised him on the spot. That's probably why we don't hear a lot about Gershom and Eliezer. They probably didn't want much to do with their dad after this. But Zipporah, she was mad. She's just like, she took the skin from Gershom and threw it at Moses, who now was no longer choking, or whatever was happening to him. I find your lack of faith disturbing. That whole kind of deal. That's how I picture this in my head. But she throws the foreskin at him and says, you're a husband of blood to me. You're making me do this to my baby. And Moses is just like, ugh. So, very, very dramatic start. This is something that needed to be taken seriously. Well, obviously she's not happy about it, but now Aaron and Moses are all ready to go and go to meet Pharaoh. Now this is where we reach the fourth event in Exodus, the plagues. The plagues of Egypt, definitely an interesting moment in history. Aaron is the spokesman. Moses is the one who'll perform the miracles because Moses was a coward. And Aaron essentially tells Pharaoh, let Israel worship God over the weekend. That was his first and only request. Pharaoh, not wanting to think of himself as anything less than what he was raised up to think that he was, the reincarnation of the Egyptian god Horus, he refuses and decides to make their lives miserable. Oh, you want a weekend off, huh? I guess I've been giving you too much free time. Tell you what, we've been supplying you with straw in order for you to make all of our buildings out of brick and mortar and stuff. Well, now you have to go to Home Depot and get the resources yourself. But you're not going to be having any leniency now. You're going to have to get the resources and be expected to make exactly the same amount of bricks that you were making before. We actually have archaeological evidence of this. A lot of the cities that are actually cited in Exodus, we can see that as the bricks started to go up, that they were built not only with haste, but also with a lessening amount of straw, to the point where they were just pure oil and mud. So, take that for what it's worth. But archaeology aside, Pharaoh refuses, and that's the real issue here. Aaron warns him that there's going to be consequences. So why should I believe in God? Well, he looks at Moses, and Moses goes, oh yeah. See? Better now. That's the power of our God, to restore life to dead flesh. Then he would take the stick, turn it into a serpent. He'd take the water, turn it to blood. But Pharaoh had some magicians on hand who may have been impressed by this. I mean, that's certainly blood. That's not the familiar materials that we're used to working with. Maybe that snake had been prepared beforehand. I'm familiar. I have a friend who's a professional magician. He knows how you could make these kind of tricks as an illusion. And certainly, just as the art of illusion is just to deceive the eye, Moses' tricks may have been sincere, but that doesn't look any different than when we're watching a magic show. It seems like these amazing things are happening, but we're being manipulated. And that's exactly what the magicians did. They manipulated Pharaoh for the purpose of him refusing God. Therefore, the issue isn't the magic, it's the message. And that's worth noting as well. But he sees that his magicians can do it, and then based on their deception and based on Moses' presentation, he decides to side with the deception and refuses to acknowledge God's authority. That was his choice. And so, consequences came. You worship the Nile River as your source of all life, the freshwater spring that supports all of you, the reason why this area was colonized. Okay, tomorrow it's going to be turned to blood. Literal blood. And indeed it did. And when Pharaoh saw this, not only did the Egyptians have to start digging elsewhere in order to get fresh water, because you can't drink blood. There's water in it, but granted, if you have other options, you'll take them. Pharaoh said, I'm sorry, consequences, I don't like it, make it go away, and then you can go away. And so Moses prays, the Nile River turns back into fresh water, but now that the consequences are gone, Pharaoh's like, I didn't mean that though. I'm still in charge, though, right? Well, why don't just your guys go? The girls and the livestock and the kids, they can all stay here. Well, God said, no deal. So, some time passes, and Pharaoh's given a second chance. Let my people go. We are only asking for a weekend, and Pharaoh chose to refuse. Well, then they said, fine. You guys worship frogs? Fine. You're going to have more frogs than you know what to do with. Your fertility god? Well, these frogs are going to be making a lot of babies. And frogs covered the entire Egyptian country. There were frogs in their ovens, in their beds, in pillowcases. It was just everywhere. I mean, you couldn't take 2 steps without going, oh, jeez. Well, that was essentially life. And Pharaoh's like, get the frogs out. I'm sorry, take back. And this mantra happened 8 times over. But you know what's also interesting about this? The third plague is what I would like to note, because it was at this plague that I think it's worth noting the magicians actually believed that Moses was from God. Remember what I told you about the lice? The Egyptians are prissy little girls. They don't like mud and dirt, and they shave their heads so they make sure that there's no lice in there. Well, here's the thing. They would worship the god of lice, and each and every one of these plagues was a mock-up, essentially, of God saying to the Egyptians, you think your God is powerful? Let me show you what a real God can do. And he debunked every single one. Oh, you worship the sun Ra? I'll make it go so black that it hurts you. Now think about that for a second. What must that darkness have been like? But he says, okay, you worship lice to make sure it won't go to you? I'll make the lice go after you specifically, but not my people. It'll be filling the people of Egypt, but not the Israelites, who, by the way, are living among you. Well, here's the interesting thing. The magicians understood, oh, Moses turned the water to blood. That's impressive. Well, how are you going to copy this, Mr. Con Man? Well, I wonder where I'm going to get bloody water. I don't know, the whole stinky Nile River? It wouldn't be hard. It's just like, oh, look, I can conjure up bloody water. Whoosh. Oh, jeez. See? Where did I get that, I wonder? Likewise, can you make frogs magically appear? Well, I wonder where I'm going to get a frog. Then all that's left there is going to be sleight of hand. See? Frog magically appeared. Then the lice show up, and the magicians are like, I thought Moses was just a really good magician. I don't know anyone or anything that could train lice. These lice are specifically targeting us. So either Moses figured out a way to train microscopic parasites, or God's actually involved in this. And it was that early on the magician says, we don't want anything to do with this. Let them go. All of Egypt is just like, Pharaoh, let them go. But Pharaoh's like, yeah, I'm in charge. And it was by the 5th plague that Pharaoh specifically chose to reject God's authority. But then the 6th plague comes along, and it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. God's no one's fool. And so, God let Pharaoh make his own choices. But once those choices had been made, he knew when he had crossed the point of no return, when his mind and heart were made up, and so God affirmed him in those choices, even if the results were catastrophic to him. It got worse, and it got worse, and it got worse, and ultimately led up to the final and 10th plague, which we know as the Passover. Now, what was interesting about the Passover plague was this. When the plague was going to occur, God said, here's how you escape it. I want you to take a spotless, a perfect, without any scar or any birth defect, an unblemished lamb. You're going to have it spend the week with you, and you're going to get emotionally attached to it, treating it like a pet. And then at the end of the week, you're going to sacrifice it. There would be a lot of grief involved, especially for the kids in this regard. Drain its blood completely out of respect for the one who gave it life. More on this in Leviticus, but life is represented by the blood. If I'm completely drained of blood, one word to describe me would not be alive. That's the point that's being made there. Now note, there are other health reasons for this as well that we have affirmed later, but understand the centuries that have passed. God could have made the Bible a 500-volume set of saying, like, here's what you don't eat, here's why you don't eat it, and going into the germ theory and all that. Or he could have just killed 2 birds with 1 stone and said, trust me. That was probably more sensical on his part, and that's what he did. But this is what's really being pointed out here. When the Passover lamb would be slaughtered, it was interesting. Drain it completely of its blood, and then you would eat every bit of it. Everything that you could, and everything else would be completely burned. Why? Because this would be the last meat meal that they would be having before they would be required to head out. They knew that after this plague, they would be not only told to leave Israel, or Egypt rather, but Israel would be paid by the Egyptians to leave their land. Well, this Passover lamb wouldn't just be a hearty meal, but they'd also do something with the blood. In order to pass over their homes with this plague that would ultimately result in the deaths of all of their firstborn children, which is a big deal in that culture, they would take the blood with this spongy material known as hyssop. It's this little branch that can soak up water. And they would take the blood and mark the lintels and the posts of the door. That's the outer sides and the top portion. But what was interesting about this is in practice, they wouldn't do it as just, mopping it up with direct application. Many accounts would actually say that they would do it at a distance. They would do it in streaks. So think about this. They'd take the blood of a perfect lamb in order to save them from the wrath of God that died in their place as a sacrifice. They would take its blood and mark it on their door downward and sideways. Downward and sideways. Downward and sideways. I think someone was giving a hint of this, especially since it was directly affirmed in John chapter 1, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, that Jesus was crucified on the Passover. More on this when we get to those passages. But all of these things being pointed out, the Israelites accepted God's means of mercy. They believed that God would provide them safety from this plague if they obeyed his commands, and the Egyptians didn't. Well, the Egyptians saw the consequences of ignoring God's mercy. They received his judgment. The Israelites were spared. And Pharaoh was not happy. He wanted Israel to get out yesterday. And then it was finally done when Egypt not only expelled the Israelites, but also, as they were leaving, they asked the Egyptians for anything to compensate. And they were more than happy to give them all the gold and treasure that they wanted. Why? Well, how long had Egypt been housing the Israelites? 400 years, right? And they'd been spending this time in slavery, so they weren't being paid for their labor. Now they were. 400 years of labor, and they took a lot of gold with them. So, this was all set in balance. And what do you know? Pharaoh changes his mind. And he decides, I'm going to get revenge for God killing all of our firstborn. I'm going to wipe out all of their borns. And so he gets the Egyptian army together and starts chasing after them. Meanwhile, Israel is being guided, not by Moses, not by Aaron, but by God. In what is known as the Shekinah glory cloud of God. They were met by this cloud that wasn't just like, something convenient in the sky that kept them shaded and, they were wandering in the wilderness because they were just following this clump of moisture. This cloud settled on the ground. It was like a fog. And it was leading them through a pillar, a tornado that wouldn't pick stuff up. This pillar of cloud. And that would keep them shaded during the day. And this not only would provide them shade from the desert heat, but it also, every single morning, produced their food. They complained when they ran out of food, and so God said, well, tell them to go outside. And there was this mysterious substance that they literally called, what is it? They didn't know, so they called it manna. And it tasted like basically sugar wafers, essentially. You could mix it up into anything that you wanted, and it would form this sort of bread-like substance. But there's been nothing like it in anything that we've ever seen. And yet it was able to perfectly provide for their physical needs, and that is what they would eat. Now, when they ran out of water much sooner, Moses was told to go to a rock, take his staff, and hit it. And it produced water. And we know from further passages exactly what that was meant to signify. More on this later, or if you can't wait, leave it in the comments. I'll be happy to answer it. Hint of Jesus, by the way. But nonetheless, this rock was struck and it provided them water. And by the way, this wasn't a coincidence. Like, maybe, Moses was tapping on the water and he found a little stream. And so when he hit the rock, it looked miraculous. This little trickling stream started to form. And, a few people were able to get some cups of water and drink it. This was enough water, fresh, drinkable, clean water, to provide for the needs of 3 to 5 million people plus livestock at once. So you could imagine this may or may not explode. Stream, right? So that's what was happening here. God was providing for Israel. He was protecting them. And then when they finally got to the border of the Red Sea, following this cloud, and by the way, that didn't just happen during the day, it also turned to fire at night. Not a fire that hurt them, but that kept them warm. Isn't that interesting? Well, they reached the border of the Red Sea. The Egyptians had finally caught up with them, and they're like, God, what are you going to do? You brought us out here to kill us, didn't you? And God said, I got this. The cloud went between the Israelites and the Egyptians and made it so dark that the horses, the people, no one could move. That's disconcerting, because it's one thing to be lost in a cloud of fog and just eventually run straight and find your way out. It's another thing when the animals are literally immobilized and everyone is so paralyzed as a result of this unnatural darkness that the cloud formed, that it allowed the people of Israel to cross the Red Sea, 3 to 5 million people plus livestock and all of their belongings, on dry land safely, not having to deal with quicksand or any of the hazards, for a few days. That's probably what it took. So think about all the information that we have here and then compare that to the skeptic's objection. It's not based on information, it's just trying to deny it. They make the crossing of the Red Sea, and then the cloud leaves the Egyptians. They see that the Red Sea has been parted. Self-explanatory. I'm sure anyone who's familiar with Exodus knows what happened there. God said, take your staff and raise it towards the Red Sea, and it parted. But then when the Egyptians came in after them, it didn't part anymore. And the entire Egyptian army was wiped out. Now, we don't know if Pharaoh also died in this. There's some historical evidence that would suggest that was the case because of a certain event at a certain time that would line up with this, in which a surrogate king was noted, and a time of severe military inactivity on their part as well. But nonetheless, I'll happily provide the links for the information on this matter. But Israel essentially just said, great, we didn't have to fight a battle. God, you fought that battle for us. But this was not the end of their journey. It was just the beginning. They'd crossed the Red Sea. The Egyptians had been taken care of. But they still needed to go to Sinai. On their way to Sinai, they were attacked by a group of people who essentially have founded themselves as a culture of terrorists by the name of the Amalekites. And the Amalekites went after not the military adept or the old or the youthful and strong, but they specifically went out of their way to harass, target, and slaughter the old, the young, and the infirm, the non-combatants. And during this battle, Joshua was the one who led it, and Moses was told, stand on top of a mountain, hold your arms up. He got tired after a while. The guy's 80 for crying out loud. So 2 men by the name of Aaron, who you know who that is, and as well another one named were able to come and support his arms and allowed him to sit down. He's the old man. So as his arms were being raised, he was told what to do by God in the moment. He gave Israel a supernatural victory. And God was the one who allowed them to drive out the Amalekites. But based on this attack, God told Israel, these guys, when you are strong militarily, you aren't right now. You don't even have weapons for crying out loud. You just have sticks and all of the farming tools that you're able to defend yourselves with. He said, when you are militarily strong, you're to deal with these people because their hearts are completely beyond salvation at this point. Or were they? Why did God not just supernaturally wipe them out in the moment? Interesting. So they would be given centuries of second chances and ultimately rejected them. And then judgment fell. But follow this as well. Same rule for the Canaanites, by the way. More on that when we get to Joshua and Deuteronomy. But what's going through all of Israel's minds at this point is, all right, Moses, so you told us to follow this cloud. Where is it leading us? And it brought them to the same spot where Moses saw the angel of the Lord at the burning bush. And God said, prepare yourselves because I'm going to show up on this mountain and I'm going to give you my law. This is going to be what governs you, what guides you, and what is the standard for everything that will be determined for your nation's fate and future from this time forward. So they're like, great. This is awesome. But then God showed up, and it was horrifying. Literally, and I mean, if the sun itself were to touch down on this earth without some shielding to protect all of us, the planet would melt. Aside from the fact that it's 200 million times the size of the planet, just the sheer power it radiates would annihilate us. Well, when God came and set foot on this earth, the one who made that sun, along with everything else in the universe, it was literally, he had to shield himself with a cloud in order for Israel not to be killed by looking at him. But it says it was a cloud as if just completely consumed by lightning and fire. Oh my. And Israel, I mean, bad enough, that light show that they were seeing, all this noise, but then God started talking and he gave them his entire law. Now note, it's not as if they hadn't heard it. They were told it by the voice of God. And they thought they were all going to have heart attacks. This was so sheerly magnificent in a good and bad way. It was just completely awesome that they were just like, Moses, if he keeps talking to us like this, we're going to die. Why don't you just go to God, you get him to write something down for us, and you talk to us, because we can't survive this. And God said, yeah, that's the point. That's why I'm using prophets. That is why that would be God's mode of communication. Because if he just spoke from the clouds and said, thus saith me, our ears would be bleeding after the second conversation. So thank him as much for that point. Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and the 70 people who were essentially the elders that were risen up to support and help Moses from the tribes of Israel, the figures of authority. If there was ever a problem with someone, then they would bring it to the family, and if the family couldn't figure it out, they'd bring it to the tribe's elder, and if the tribe's elder couldn't figure it out, they'd then bring it to Moses. And so Moses wouldn't be tending to the needs and questions and complaints of 3 to 5 million people for the next 40 years. Ugh. Didn't take Ruel's advice to figure that one out, but God supported it and used Ruel when he met Moses and took, obviously Zipporah and Gershom and Eliezer didn't want to hang out with Dad anymore. They went back with Grandpa. They had met him in the Sinai Peninsula before God made this interaction and said, look, Moses, you can't do this all by yourself. You're going to kill yourself. Have people risen up. And God said, So, 70 people, along with Moses, Aaron, and his 2 sons, Nadab and Abihu, they were invited to come up to the mountain with God. And they met there Jesus. And they had a meal with him. So this is some pretty amazing stuff. They had this interaction with God. They had made the Exodus. And for the next, well, at this point in their history, it seemed like everything was going great. Moses and his assistant Joshua both went up to the mountain, and Moses spent the next 40 days with God, where he was receiving the history written in Genesis, where he was recording everything up until this point that was happening in Exodus, and most specifically was recording God's law, which is included in Exodus chapters 20 through 23 and the book of Leviticus. Numbers was their history that would occur after this, and Deuteronomy was the last series of sermons that Moses made before his death, right before they entered the Promised Land. More on that when we get to those books. But this is when they come to the mountain, and this is where they receive God's law. And note, Israel had just heard it, and no one had not heard it. They all knew the standard that they would be following and exactly why. This is a very impressive being that had now demonstrated through miraculous signs that he was not only real, but that he was their authority. And the law can basically be summarized in these three categories. First, how God was to be honored, and this would be through the Sabbath, through sacrifices, through the feasts of unleavened bread, Pentecost, trumpets, tabernacles, all these different things that were laid out for and expected of Israel, and how they would honor God. Second was how your fellow man was to be treated. This included not just the treatment of slaves and the punishments for violence, but even animal control laws and requirements for restoration of lost or stolen property, and an especial emphasis on the care of poor, unfortunate, and widowed, and equal treatment for even non-Jews. And so you know I'm not just blowing hot air here. Exodus 22 verse 21, it says, "You shall neither mistreat a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." So in the context of a foreign people living in a foreign land, when they go to the land of Canaan, it's not xenophobic, just borders all set all around him and saying, no one's going to live in here. The only people who were driven out were those who had centuries of second chances to not only get their acts together and recognize God, but also to accept the ones that he was using to communicate with him. We know individuals like Melchizedek who was ministering to the Canaanites at this time. And we also know that his great-grandson Adonai-Zedek wasn't for a lack of information. He had just chosen to reject God, just like all of his nation. And it wasn't until you had every reason to trust God but hadn't, that judgment fell. God offers mercy before justice. If you reject mercy, this is all that's left. So follow the logic here. And then lastly, of course, the law included the building instructions for the tabernacle and everything in it. And the reason why it was so specific is because it was modeled after something else. It would be God's throne in heaven. But then, well, after swearing to keep the law, Israel complains to Aaron that Moses is taking too long. And they ask him to make a calf, something that they can worship. And Aaron says, well, do you have any gold with you? Yeah, plenty. They gave as much as they could to him. And he took a grafting tool, so this was deliberate, and he made them a calf that was based on an actual Egyptian deity. And if you want to know the details, just ask in the comments. But Aaron basically said, this is Hashem. This is the true and living God that delivered you from Egypt. And they dedicated this pagan deity to the worship of the true and living God. Now remember, Egypt was a pagan culture, and how they worshipped was completely... It wasn't G-rated, let's just say it that much. The idols were just basically an excuse and an afterthought that confirmed people's pursuit of bad habits. This didn't just include the ingestion of narcotics like we see for individuals like the oracle at Delphi. The worship of those Greek and pagan deities were ultimately done just by exposing yourself to volcanic fumes and your special herbs that only the priest had access to, and allowed you to speak the language of the gods from the oracle, and then the other priests would interpret this language only they understood, while they were basically just high on shrooms. And that was basically what that worship was, the worship of the pagan god Diana or Aphrodite or Ashtoreth in Canaanite culture. That was basically all their priestesses were prostitutes, and there's no other way to describe it. Molech was worshipped through abortion. You look at all these things, and it's just basically conforming a pervert's lifestyle. Well, Egypt had basically been immersed in all of this, and they had a god for everything and its mother. So when the Israelites think worship, they had just heard what God's standards were, but 40 days had passed. And, that's kind of old news. I mean, where are we now? And so they remembered this golden calf. They remembered how the Egyptians worshipped it, and they started to do exactly that in the name of the true and living God. I'll just say it. They began all violently having sex with each other. The entire nation. Well, God was aware of this, and he told Moses, get back down there because this is not good. Well, Moses took the written law, which, by the way, wasn't just the 10 Commandments, it was everything. They had taken everything that they had needed. He brought the tablets down. He saw everything that was going on, looked at the tablets and said, what law aren't you breaking right now? And he smashed it. I mean, first edition, autographed by the hand of God, these stone tablets that would have been their law. And oh my gosh, Moses, you wrecked it. I mean, what does that do to the collector's value? I'm making jokes here, but you understand the point. This was a bad situation. They had literally broken the law. And so, Israel figuratively, Moses literally, but you're looking at all this and going, oh my gosh, what's going to happen now? Well, first off, consequences, immediate for certain. Moses looked at Aaron and said, what the heck? What the literal heck? And Aaron's like, I don't know, I threw gold in the fire, and it was their fault, and this thing came out, and they did it. So he just took the golden calf, ground it into powder, put it in the river in which they were drinking out of, and said, drink it. And Israel had to. Then he said, everyone who started this, you now have some explaining to do. Anyone who doesn't want anything to do with this, who is just caught up in all of this, stand behind me. If you stand with God, stand behind us. And those who proudly stood for their stand in this reformed and progressive religion, well, they were all executed. And rightly so. Not only had they done what they had done, but they had done so after having seen everything as to why the contrary was a bad idea. Then, in light of all they had been held responsible for, Moses looked at the rest of them and said, you all deserve lightning bolts right now. God doesn't want to kill wicked people, but you have earned this. I'm going to pray for you and see if there's anything that can be done for this. And so God let Moses speak first because this was important. Moses said, I'm willing to be punished on behalf of all of them. Kill me. Execute me for their crimes. I'm willing to die so that they can live. How awesome is Moses? But God said, no. I'm going to hold these people responsible. Those who were responsible have been dealt with. But that's my job. No one's going to take anyone's responsibility but their own. I'm the one who's going to pay for the sins of others. So that point is made. God spares the entire nation. Those who started the orgy were executed. And finally, Israel renews their promise to keep God's law. And now that they have the instructions for the tabernacle in writing, Moses got another copy made from God. There were people that started to be filled with the Holy Spirit and used their talents and gifts not as preachers but as sculptors, as artisans and sewers, and everyone who would be needed to contribute to this tabernacle in which their offerings would be given. And so the obedience to this law was provided through this tabernacle, but all of these things, this giant tent, was completed, and Israel donated more than enough to support it, because obviously they were sorry from what happened before. Everyone who wasn't sorry had been dealt with too. But that was ultimately where Israel leaves at the book of Exodus. They're getting ready to leave Sinai and head towards the promised land, and they're following the angel of the Lord, God incarnate, in this cloud. And as he's protecting them, providing for them, and prospering them on the basis of their agreement, of their covenant. You obey the law, you're blessed. You reject the law, you're cursed. The wages of sin is death. But here's the point to this entire book. For there could only be one thing taken away from all of this, it's this. Israel was not perfect, but God made them a promise, and that was one he planned to keep. Thank you for your time. I look forward to continuing this in the next study, which will be in the book of Leviticus. If you'd like to join us, you can see it on the playlist or just wait for the time of release. I thank you for your time to listen to this study. If you have questions, ask them. Sincerity is the only standard. And once again, thank you for taking the time to invest this in your relationship with God. I hope that this has been a blessing to you. And if you'd like to see more or further details, let me know. I'll be more than happy to meet you exactly where you're at. Thank you for your time. Remember that God's made you a promise too, that anyone who believes in the name of his Son will be saved. And God bless you.